Welcome, we're joined by Noric Dilanchian, who has been a business lawyer and consultant since 1983. His focus is on contract drafting and review, intellectual property, and information technology. Noric, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
So to start off, can you tell us a bit about your background, where you live, where you're from, and about your Armenian background in general?
In terms of where I live, nowadays it's very philosophical in terms of where I live, but in terms of where I came from, I guess there's some physical realities that are easily explained. I was born in Iran, in Tehran. My parents are therefore Iranian Armenian from back till 400 years. My father sent his two eldest sons to the school in Calcutta in India, where they received an education in English. After graduating, they found their way to Australia, like a lot of Indian Armenians did, and that resulted in chain migration to Australia. So in terms of just that aspect, that's me. Now, in arriving in Australia, Australia was a very unwelcoming country to people from abroad in the 60s still, changed dramatically from the 1970s. For various reasons, I was not connected with the Armenian community from about the age of 9 to 24. In fact, I rejected Armenians because I could see nothing of value. It seemed to be terribly ethnic, very insular, boring. But after I finished university, where I did humanities and law, actually through the mechanism of being keen about what was happening to the Palestinians in Lebanon in 1982, one day I arrived home and my father said, "Where were you today?" And I said, "I was at a Palestinian demonstration." And he said, "Oh, our story's the same." And I said, "What do you mean?" And then it began where I kind of got involved in understanding my own heritage. And I was kind of fortunate because in my travels, you can travel when you're young, in my travels I ended up living in the homes of a lot of scholars in America or in France. And now I'm sort of like friends of their sons. So that's what I mean by living in a mental space that's philosophical, meaning that nowadays with the internet, with social media, you can basically live anywhere, as we have seen people doing nowadays, in that social media creates all these echo chambers and these separate identities of people.
And in terms of education as applied to your work, your career began as a book publishing lawyer. You've since been in business, IP and IT lawyer, and a lecturer. And you have a passion for history and culture. So how did these activities shape your thinking exactly?
It's often said that your first job shapes you. Certainly it did for me. So arriving after law school in a book publishing company and being an in-house lawyer for a book publisher meant I was surrounded by the most common job description was editor. And then you had graphic designer. So being in that creative environment meant that I could understand what had occurred over the last 300 years in industrialization, because a book begins with a manuscript, goes through editing, and ends up in a product that has to be sold. So that was kind of useful for me. So I was shaped by that first job. It also shaped me because rather than having a secretary in 1983, I was given an IBM display writer, which was pretty rare for a lawyer to have a computer in 1983 in Australia. So that got me involved in drafting contracts. I do like writing, and for me, writing contracts is the same as writing because you're gathering your views. So really, the rest of my career has always remained shaped by that first job, in that I draft contracts. I'm an intellectual property lawyer, which means I'm involved with trademarks and copyright and patents. And the really big challenge and the most interesting one is the business models, like how do you create new businesses from that which a client has? And at the same time, going back to what I was saying earlier about philosophy, dialogue with clients is really important. And for me, law can get dreadfully boring unless you have that dialogue. And I find the history studies, it's like my hobby in a way, but it actually helps me also to explain where the world's come from, what ills it, what creates society, what destroys society. And while I had your normal historical education that you have in an Anglophone world, Australia being a colony of England, it was a very English kind of education. And so things like Greece, Rome, and Egypt before it were drilled into one. But after university, I got involved in something closer to Armenia, which is the history of Mesopotamia. And I've learned a lot about how civilization works from that study of history.
Right. And in Australia, you and a group of Sydney Armenian lawyers recently collaborated on a project to support Artsakh. Currently, you have a working draft, 40-pager entitled Artsakh, Culture, Property Law and Related Resources. Can you tell us a bit about this and the importance of cultural property?
But before I talk about the importance of cultural property and the work we were doing, just a little overview, because the Armenian Australian community is not well known. So the generic numbers are that there's 50,000 Australian Armenians. We do know for sure that there's 6,000 people on the Armenians of Australia Facebook group. So that gives us a stat that we can work with. It's a community that has its origins in terms of having a community-like character from the late 50s, but accelerating because of all the diasporan remigrations that have occurred from mostly the Middle East. And that occurred in the 70s and the 80s, just as it did elsewhere. Currently, much to my amazement, I discovered late last year that there are now 100 lawyers in Australia that are of Armenian origin. And there's probably about 15 people studying law. I was, I believe, the second or the third lawyer who with an Armenian background in Australia. So you can see the shifts occurred. You can see that the migration of Armenians to Australia has had the same pattern as elsewhere, meaning these people are very devoted towards education and prosperity and betterment. So when the group of my friends, established lawyer friends, got together late last year because of what was happening in Artsakh, we basically were doing things that were, in a sense, adjunct to what the Armenian National Committee locally was doing. And more specifically, I took it upon myself to rewrite some of the stuff about the legal status of Artsakh to make it more presentable and more of a narrative rather than bullet points. So that was our initial task. And of course, like many people, November 10 arrived with a great surprise. And so there had to be a shift in terms of focus areas. Now, being involved in culture myself and the history of old Julfa, new Julfa, the khachkars of Julfa, I've been collecting this stuff and studying this stuff for decades. Being involved in all that made me immediately realize that the whole issue of cultural property in Artsakh is going to be a major issue. So for me, it was a question of gathering something, again, to tell a story, to tell a narrative, to put it in context. The challenging bit for me and for many is actually the cultural law aspect. Cultural law is a very new field for me, but it obviously has a legal existence. So over the course of the next few weeks or months, the aim is to bring together that document, which is on cultural property in Artsakh. Why is it at risk? What laws might apply? Who should do what? Who is doing what? In doing all that, what I found to be the most useful thing is just creating a resource database. Like, who are the players in this area? Because there's lots of people from Denver, Colorado through to Yerevan who are doing things. And then there's lots of video resources. I mean, YouTube for me is just a gold mine. So in that document, I've listed all of the YouTube videos and the metadata relating to them that is relevant. So essentially, I wanted to create a resource that could be a tool for other people to work with.
And your work involves business in a form that business modeling and economics. In your opinion, what conditions does Armenia need in order to create prosperity?
Obviously, that's a very complex question, and it's one that involves cross-disciplinary thinking, in fact, multidisciplinary thinking. But I think there's some things that people have to let go of. and some things they have to rush very quickly to adopt. My personal view is, speaking as a diasporan, that Armenians are way too stuck in nostalgia and into what I call symbolic ethnicity. It's been observed in other diasporas, Jewish and otherwise, that essentially those that become diasporan tend to have this fixed view of what the homeland was when they left, and that doesn't change for them, which is the reason why you get this symbolic ethnicity. You know, people, I am not religious, but people, you know, saying lovely things about Jesus will save you, and people being nostalgic about, I don't know, a whole bunch of things from food to clothing to symbols. I don't think that's going to get you very far. So I think there are things that need to be lost. I think we're in a period of history globally, and I'm not just talking about Armenians, but we're in what historians might refer to as an interregnum. It's a period where there is no dominant power. There is a shift towards what I believe is Eurasia. And around Eurasia, we've got your China, Russia, Iran, Armenia's in there, nations as well as India. And we know that the pivot point of a lot of history is actually Eurasia. So it's not going to be too much of a surprise if over the next 3 decades things shift in that direction. So one's got to, when one's thinking about the prosperity of Armenia, think about the realignment. And I know others in interviews in CivilNet have referred to this, but this realignment is really important. I mean, being somebody from Iran in his origins, and I've discovered before the interview, you are also from Iran, means that we have an affinity with this civilization that is older than Armenian civilization. I mean, it's 5,000 years of history. And so the opportunities from an economic, moral support perspective are very real. So I think the thing is that for the prosperity of Armenians and Armenia, education has to come to the center. Obviously, good governance is really important. Good policy is really important. And one cannot just import, and this is the main point, one cannot just import models from abroad and work with labels like, oh, democracy. All of these labels are now really up for redefinition, just as the label Western values we saw during the Artsakh war was completely up for values. Even the word human rights and human rights organization became up for value. Up for re-evaluation. I think a shroud or a veil has been removed, and I think it's a moment to race towards the clarity that I think Armenians have, because they have this 2,500 years of clarity about how you create a civilization, grow a civilization, and how a civilization erodes. And so I think we are dealing with a period in history where the very notion of what a human being is in this century will be redefined, but also so too will what is a civilization and why is it important. And at the end of the day, as the famous saying says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So it's up to us to improve the culture.
And finally, I want to ask, oh, sorry.
Prosperity. That would lead to prosperity is the perspective that I come from. Obviously, inclusive of the concept of culture is business and governance and many other branches.
And finally, I want to ask about your work as a collector. You have a photo collection which includes about 6,000 images and maps associated with Armenia. Can you tell us why you decided to do this work as a collector and the end goals for the resources that you have in mind?
The why answer begins with just plain interest. I like images. You know, you've heard from me that I've been involved with books, and you know, from books I've been involved in assisting filmmakers and other people. So the thing is that the photo collection is really about trying to visualize information, specifically historical information. When I have sought to understand Armenian history, I've obviously had to read text, I've tried to engage in having videos made, like the Genocide Survivors in Australia series in the 1980s. But the thing is that photos and images of objects in museums are an amazing wealth, because when you see them, they are able to tell you so much more than the text will in an instant sort of way. So my ambition is that with these sort of 6,000 images that are categorized and metadataed and put into chronological order and interconnected with keywords, my ambition is that that like that cultural property work that I'm doing, that it becomes a resource. You also told me before we met that you have an Italian background. If you have these resources, be it Italian, Iranian, if you're an Iranian Armenian, or Australian, or whatever, access to resources is the way creativity kind of can flower. When a filmmaker, book writer, journalist, videographer doesn't have the images, doesn't have the ability to visualize things, then the whole approach towards getting people more involved in something of importance isn't there. We saw that Hollywood made the 20th century for a lot of cultures, and Hollywood flowed into American television as an export industry. And all along there you had the African-American music tradition. So the thing is that if the 20th century was about American culture, the question arises, what is the 21st century? And really, you either, as they say in academia, you either publish or you perish.
Well, Noric, that was very enlightening, and thank you very much for your time.
It was a pleasure, Emilio. Thank you very much for the conversation. All right. Cheers for now.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.